Welcome back to the Mike Bates Show. This is Mike Bates. So what are Democrats going to do to assure their victory in 2020? Well, if you look at all the mail-in voting that is going to be happening, that alone will probably be enough. I don't have time today to go into examples of mail-in voter fraud. But if you go back and listen to my August 22nd show, it's on the podcast page at www.themikebatesshow.com. I cited over 24 cases of vote-by-mail fraud. I gave names, dates, contests, charges, verdicts, sentences, and even the names and offices of elected officials who had to resign when it was shown they won their races via vote-by-mail ballot fraud. There were hundreds of cases I had. I only had time to cite 25. But of those 25, I cited 8 where the outcome of the election was proven to have been changed by vote-by-mail ballot fraud. So even though the so-called news media is telling you all the time, oh, there's no evidence of mail fraud, there's no evidence of ballot fraud, there's no evidence of election fraud, Trump's just making this up, he's scaring people, it never happens. Well, first of all, the question is one stolen race okay? It's not to me. But I cited 8 of them, and I didn't even have time to cite them all. But this year, using the pandemic as their excuse, the Democrats are pulling out all the stops to try to get a ballot in the hands of every single registered voter, whether they request it or not. Now, I have no problem with true absentee ballots where a voter requests it. My problem is with just mailing a ballot to every registered voter, because as polluted as our voter rolls are, that opens the door to commit vote fraud on a massive scale. Colorado, Hawaii, Oregon, Washington, and Utah have done vote by mail for many elections. And they claim there's no fraud, even though there have been convictions in those states for vote by mail fraud. But with the exception of Utah, those states are also all dark blue. So there's no reason for Democrat operatives to conspire to engage in widespread fraud because their party is going to win without it. But in battleground states where races could go either way, the Democrats will absolutely conspire to commit voter fraud. And while I don't like universal vote by mail at all because it's so vulnerable to fraud, at least those states enacted it through the legislative process. I don't like it, but at least it was legally created under the law. But I have a huge problem with state governors simply imposing universal vote by mail via executive order. And many have done that. Montana's Democrat Governor Steve Bullock decreed that universal mail-in voting was okay. The Republican legislature didn't authorize it. The Democrat governor simply decreed it from on high. And an Obama-appointed federal judge, Dana Christensen, upheld it as a legitimate exercise of the governor's responsibility to keep citizens safe from COVID. Now understand that Montana law doesn't allow it. But the Democrat governor and the Democrat judge simply conjured it into existence and gave it judicial support as being legitimate, even though it isn't. Now you might be thinking, but Mike, Montana's a reliably red state. What difference will it make? Well, it may not matter in the presidential race, but Montana will also be electing a new governor on November 3rd. Governor Bullock is term limited out, so he's not running for re-election. But wait, it gets better. And by better, I really mean worse. Guess what Steve Bullock is running for? The United States Senate! Yep. Steve Bullock, who unconstitutionally allowed universal vote by mail in Montana, and remember, vote by mail always favors Democrats, is polling in a dead heat with the Republican incumbent Senator Steve Daines. Daines won by 17 points in 2014. But at least according to the polls, He, like many Republican senators across the country, are vulnerable. So not only will Governor Bullock's unconstitutional power grab help elect Steve Bullock himself, it could also help tip the Senate to the Democrats. But that's only one example in one state. As Democrats always do, they will file lawsuits after the elections demanding that unelected judges overturn long-established election law in the name of making sure that every vote counts. But of course that's nonsense, because by that time the legal votes will have already been counted. It's the illegal votes the Democrats want counted. And by illegal, I mean both the fraudulent votes and the votes where the required procedure wasn't followed. Am I speculating? No, that's standard operating procedure for Democrats. They do it to some extent after every election, especially if the election is close enough to get a recount. Democrats have a history of stealing elections through recounts. They're not always successful in their attempts, but you know what does happen in every recount? The Democrat candidate's vote count goes up, and the margin narrows. Why doesn't the margin ever narrow in favor of the Republican? Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with a recount in and of itself. The problem is when the recount becomes a new count of previously uncounted ballots that were miraculously found by election officials. And that's how Democrats have successfully stolen elections in the past. In every recount of the past 20 years, Democrats have found boxes of uncounted ballots, and they have all favored the Democrat candidate. Having learned from their failed attempt at election theft in 2000's Bush v. Gore, the Democrats successfully stole elections in 2004 and 2008. Let's take our break now, and when we get back, I'll give you the details of that. When the Mike Bates Show continues. Welcome back to the Mike Bates Show. This is Mike Bates. As I said before the break, Democrats learned from their failed attempt at stealing the presidency from George Bush in 2000, and they perfected their strategy for election theft, which they used in 2004 and 2008 to steal elections. There are many examples, but the two biggies that come to mind are Gregoire Rossi in 2004. That was the Washington state governor's race. And then Franken Coleman, which was the U.S. Senate race in Minnesota in 2008. Both were concentrated in jurisdictions dominated by Democrats, and both found previously uncounted ballots for the recount. And those found ballots, of course, favored the Democrats. In Washington state, Republican Dino Rossi led the count on election night, but by a small enough margin that it triggered a recount. And during the recount, a whole bunch of previously uncounted ballots were found. And guess who most of those votes went to? That's right, the Democrat. And in the end, Chris Gregoire, the Democrat, won by 133 votes. In 2008, the incumbent Republican senator from Minnesota, Norm Coleman, won his re-election by 725 votes based on the election night results. But because his margin of victory was narrow, there was a recount. And for almost 6 months, Democrats complained in court about the state's election laws that their party had put in place through the legislative process. They filed lawsuit after lawsuit after lawsuit to muddy the waters while their operatives found enough ballots to steal the election from the Republicans. And in the end, Democrat Al Franken was declared the winner by 312 votes. And 8 months after Election Day, his presence in the United States Senate gave the Democrats the 60th vote necessary to prevent a Republican filibuster of the Obamacare bill. And with that supermajority, they passed Obamacare into law. So don't tell me election fraud is too insignificant to make a difference. If Coleman had kept his seat, we would never have had Obamacare. And although it's slightly off topic because we're talking about Democrat operatives conspiring to cheat, not just individual Democrats deciding on their own to cheat, it was proven that more than 1,000 convicted felons voted in that Minnesota Senate race. And that's more than 3 times Al Franken's margin of victory. Now, you can't see me, but I just made air quotes when I said margin of victory, because Franken didn't legitimately win that election. But he was certified as the winner, and he served in the U.S. Senate because of it. And let's not forget that Democrats found new ballots 2 years ago in Florida's 2018 statewide recount in the races for U.S. Senate, Governor, and Commissioner of Agriculture. Both Rick Scott for U.S. Senate and Ron DeSantis for Governor were ahead of their Democrat opponents, Bill Nelson and Andrew Gillum, in the initial Election Day count. And Democrats did find a bunch of pro-Nelson and pro-Gillum ballots after Election Day. It just wasn't enough to change the outcome, so the Republicans won. But it did narrow the margins of victory. They just didn't cheat enough. But in the race for Commissioner of Agriculture, which in Florida is a very important cabinet position that oversees a lot more than just farms, Democrat Nikki Fried lost to Republican Matt Caldwell by 0.5%, according to the count on election night. But in the recount, she managed to eke out a win. And yes, previously uncounted ballots for her were discovered and counted. And that gave her the come-from-behind questionable win. And where did those new ballots miraculously appear? Why, Brevard, Broward, and Palm Beach counties, of course. 3 very heavily Democrat counties in South Florida with reputations for elections malfeasance. And it should be noted that it was the manual recount, which is subject to human interpretation, that gave Fried her victory. Matt Caldwell sued, asking the court to order that the objective machine recount be certified, because he won that. But the Democrat judge refused, and Nikki Fried was declared the winner by 0.08%. Now picture that scenario happening with the Trump-Biden counts in Florida, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Ohio. And while we're speculating, we might as well throw in Arizona, Georgia, Iowa, North Carolina, and Texas. Those are all states Donald Trump won in 2016 that can go to Biden this year. And if you believe the polling, and I'm not saying that you should, but if you believe the polling, Trump is in trouble in every one of those states, even Texas. Texas! A poll released Tuesday had Biden leading Trump in Texas 49% to 46%. Trump won Texas 4 years ago by 9.2%. And if Texas goes blue, and despite the current polling data, I'd frankly be surprised if it does, but if Texas does go blue, Trump is toast. It would be a national bloodbath in the Electoral College. And if that blue wave does happen in the presidential race, it will affect the down-ballot races for House and Senate also, and usher in the full Democrat takeover I warned you about in the first segment of today's show. And just as an FYI, I served as an appointed official observer of that 2018 Florida recount. I was at the Escambia County Supervisor of Elections office, and everything I observed was transparent and proper. But I suspect the South Florida recount was not. And here's the thing about the recount. I know the rules in Florida very well, but every state has its own rules. Now, the reason I know Florida's election laws so well is because I have observed the ballot tabulation process in person many times since 2000. And I have interviewed the supervisors of elections for both Escambia and Santa Rosa counties more times than I could possibly remember. So I'm quite familiar with how the process is supposed to work. But I've also studied the tactics of dishonest Democrats in previous election thefts, which is why I know their playbook well. Democrats will cheat nationwide the same way they cheat in Florida. The first way the Democrats will cheat is to stuff the ballot box with questionable ballots, such as absentee ballots that come in after the deadline established by law, provisional ballots that are required to be set aside for later review, or perhaps even outright fraudulent ballots fabricated by Democrat operatives. That's what happened 2 years ago in Florida. And while it's not impossible that there was a perfectly legitimate and lawful reason those ballots existed, the Democrat supervisors of elections in South Florida never explained their existence. Once invalid ballots are commingled with valid ballots, it's impossible to ever separate them. In 2018, the Broward County, Florida Supervisor of Elections, Brenda Snipes, acknowledged that more than 200 invalid ballots had contaminated the vote pool. But once they were mixed in, they got counted, period. There's no way to remove them. And those were just what we know about. How many don't we know about? Snipes also admitted that she misplaced at least 2,000 legitimate ballots. Now, sure, that made Brenda Snipes look like an incompetent fool, but I think it's far more likely that she or her handlers knew exactly what they were doing. I think they were masking their fraud behind an appearance of incompetence. But I see their actions as deliberate criminal violations of the law. Nobody in that office was charged, but Brenda Snipes did resign, which ended the investigation. So those are a few examples of election theft committed by Democrats in the past. What are they going to do this year? I'll tell you when the Mike Bates Show continues. Welcome back to the Mike Bates Show. This is Mike Bates. So what are the Democrat plans to steal the election for 2020? If the stuffing of the ballot box is unsuccessful, then the Democrats will move on to challenging ballots that were deemed improperly cast. This is when the canvassing board must determine the legitimacy of provisional ballots. Provisional ballots are cast by people whose status as a legal voter is in doubt. They're permitted to vote, but their ballots receive additional scrutiny later to determine if they were lawfully cast and thus would be legal to count. In that 2018 recount in Florida, there were provisional ballots that were known to be cast by non-citizens. They were known to be illegal, but the Democrats wanted to count them. Think about that. Do you need any more evidence that Democrats have contempt for the law? If the Democrats are unsuccessful in their initial attempts to steal the elections, they'll get sympathetic judges who will ignore the plain text of the law to order that illegal ballots be included in the official tabulation. They'll, of course, present this as, but every ballot must be counted, or it's not fair to people who have voted to have their voice ignored, or the people's voice must not be silenced, or some other specious arguments to justify violating the law. Democrats regularly sue to demand that judges extend the very clear deadlines established by election law. Whether it's registration deadlines, polling hours, postmark dates, or the number of days after an election mailed-in ballots could still be counted, or even the deadline for tabulating and certifying the official vote count, Democrats sue to void them and replace them with whatever they think will give them a tactical advantage. And what usually happens is that even though the laws don't allow an extension, some activist Democrat judge will order that the law be broken to allow the Democrats to take their sweet time counting the ballots, which of course gives the Democrats more time to potentially come up with enough illegal votes for the Democrats to win. Make no mistake, Democrats will employ dishonest propaganda, illegal procedures, and leftist judges who violate their oaths of office in an all-out effort to overturn the legitimate results of a lawful election. It's disgraceful, but it is standard operating procedure for today's un-American Democrats. And when the Republicans properly argue that the Democrats are asking a judge to clearly violate the law, the Democrats attack them as unpatriotic monarchists. They say, "Don't you know that our forefathers fought and died for the right to vote?" Well, they wouldn't say forefathers because they think that's oppressive and patriarchal, but they'd say, "Don't you think our foreparents fought and died for the right to vote? Yet you Republicans think their votes shouldn't count?" Those ballots were cast by decent Americans who care about this country. They took the time to vote. They want to participate in our democracy. They overcame all the Republican efforts to obstruct and disenfranchise their votes, yet they managed with their last ounce of strength to cast a ballot. How dare you suggest we not count them? It's not the voters' fault that the ballots were misplaced during the original count. It's not the voters' fault the ballot was so confusing. What, are you suggesting that they're fraudulent ballots? Oh, the horror! How dare you suggest such a thing? After the Russians helped Trump win in 2016, you have the audacity to question the integrity of the process? The vote is sacred. Every ballot must be counted. Blah, blah, blah. And they'll say it in that same tone, too. And that's why every ballot, no matter how obviously fraudulent, gets included in a recount. And those arguments are made for every fraudulent ballot until the Democrat candidate surpasses the Republican. And then the recount must immediately stop. After all, the voters have spoken, and you Republican Trump-tards need to accept the results. Today's Democratic Party needs to be identified as what they are: a dangerous enemy of our republic. Joseph Stalin would be proud of them, though. Remember, it was Joseph Stalin who said, "The people who cast the votes decide nothing. The people who count the votes decide everything." So we need to make sure that Donald Trump wins by a large enough margin that these Stalinist Democrats can't steal the election. My purpose today was not to depress you. It was to motivate you. One of my favorite cartoons is the drawing of the stork, or the crane, whatever it is. Maybe it's a heron. But it's got a frog in its mouth. And the frog is reaching around with his forearms, gripping the throat of this bird tightly. And the caption says, "Never, ever give up." I'm Mike Bates. Thanks for listening.